Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Your Mark on the World show. I'm your host, Devin Thorpe. I'm a Forbes contributor covering social entrepreneurship and impact investing. And today we have two really wonderful guests. We have with us today Andrea Armeni, who's the executive director and co-founder of Transform Finance, and along with him, the co-author of a report that they've done together, Meredith Benton, who is an old hand, a proven, experienced professional in the impact investing sphere. So, Andrea and Meredith, welcome to the show. We're glad to have you here.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us, Devin. Big fan.
Well, thank you. Andrea, it's good to have you back, and I'm glad that you brought a friend. It'll be a great discussion. Recently, you two put together an investor briefing on renewable energy that dealt with the risks and the issues facing those who are doing renewable energy projects, especially in the developing world. Can you give us just a quick recap, Andrea, of what you see in that report?
Yes, absolutely. This is a project that we started working on together with Eniko Horvath at the Business and Human Rights Resource Center in the UK that has been focusing on issues, of course, of human rights for companies and for investors for a long time. From the Transform Finance perspective, this was an area that really goes back to our genesis as an organization, trying to see what are the impacts on communities of this new wave of alternative ways of moving capital. And seeing, for example, as my co-founder Morgan Simon and I visited projects in the Isthmus of Tehuantepec in the Mexican state of Oaxaca, the lack of benefits that there were for local communities, and also the issues around really the negative consequences, which ideally we would try to avoid in the developing field of impact investing. And we're fortunate to build on this work with Meredith Benton. We did a webinar on this issue a while back for our Transform Finance Investor Network that garnered sufficient interest from the investor community that we decided to turn it into a more fleshed out briefing.
Fantastic. Well, Meredith, have you seen these issues arise in your work that Andrea alluded to, that you've covered in this paper in terms of the negative impacts on local communities when renewable projects are undertaken?
We have seen it multiple times. It's one of the things that catalyzed this report and the creation of this report was that we were beginning to see an increased number of incidents within the renewable energy space as these large-scale projects were beginning to be developed. And we have very extensive research that shows when there is the need for land and land acquisition in other industries, in other sectors, mining and resource extraction in particular, to not have strong programs in place that deal with community consent, involvement, and empowerment can hurt the investment over the long term. So we wanted to raise awareness in advance of this growing wave of renewable energy and to avoid what we could see coming.
Yeah, it's almost counterintuitive and really surprising to me as I contemplate this, because I always anticipate that when I hear about the idea of solar and wind in the developing world, I'm picturing projects that are benefiting directly a local population and that are often directed by that local population. And what you're telling me is that many of these projects are being done without their cooperation and not for their benefit. So who is benefiting from these projects? Who's driving them? And how is it that the local population isn't participating, Meredith?
So the financing around renewable energy projects is complex and would probably take up almost the entirety of the time we have to discuss it. But what is happening with these large-scale projects is that it's usually a consortium of international and domestic developers. And what's concerning is that, particularly when we talk about local communities where there's an extensive, so there's the tract of land that's of interest, these are the areas that are probably have been too windy in the past, they've been too hot, too sunny in the past for there to be too much development interest. So this is the first time these communities have been approached with a resource that's being sought out. And they aren't necessarily able to act as their own advocates because those experiences have not been needed in the past.
So Andrea, is it your experience that the local communities are then being taken advantage of? Again, the paradigm and I think others have of what's going on in the developing world is that the projects are for the benefit of local communities. And what I'm hearing you say is they're using their land, but they're not getting the benefit of the projects.
That's quite correct, Devin. I think you've jumped right into the core of the issue here from the community perspective and really hinting at the fundamental work of transform finance that from the start of our transformative finance principles focuses around the idea that if these are projects that are done for impact, they should benefit the population that is supposed to be impacted by them. So this turns out not to be the case in practice. I would say on the one hand, in terms of the negative consequences that you were alluding to before, but also in terms of not going as far as they possibly could in terms of empowering and creating asset building opportunities within these communities. So maybe we can parse out these two issues. On the one hand, there is, as Meredith was mentioning, the pretty much wholesale exploitation of the fact that these are communities that have historically not been enabled to be sophisticated to negotiate this sort of agreements. And while, as you were saying, Devin, one would assume that renewable energy projects have much higher standards on the social side, it's also true that because the focus has been less on these renewable energy projects, actually they're less scrutinized than even a lot of the type of extractive industry, mining projects that we normally associate with the lack of community benefits. So on the one hand, yes, there have been on the ground a lot of instances of lack of consideration, lack of agency, lack of accountability for the communities. The Accountability Council has been documenting for years. There's been a tremendous increase in the type of complaints that go to the ombudsman or ombudsman-like entities at the International Finance Corporation, at other multilaterals. On the positive side, we have seen a bit of a disregard for example, where this energy is being used. So when we talk about big initiatives such as Power Africa, you and I might imagine that all of a sudden in countries or in regions where previously there was no access to electricity, now they're electrified and the kid can read at night. That's not often the case. These big projects tend to go straight to, say, an aluminum smelter or some other kind of industrial scale use of electricity, that while it's true that it's positive, it's better to produce aluminum with wind energy than to produce aluminum with coal energy, it doesn't necessarily have that direct positive impact that we would associate with them. If I may add one thing to that, the problem with the perception of renewable energy being intrinsically good for communities is that there is this big disconnect between the investors into these projects and what happens on the ground, right? With the high degree of intermediation that there is in project finance nowadays, you are quite a few steps removed, right? If you go to your asset manager or to your wealth advisor and say that you want to put your money into clean energy projects, there will be several steps before it hits the ground. And you're likely to wake up in 5 years and say, oh, wait a second, that's not what I had in mind when I said I wanted to invest in renewable energy.
Now, Meredith, it seems to me that Andrea kind of touched on this idea, but it seems to me that the scale may be correlated with the problem. And that is when someone goes in to produce electricity on a microgrid for a village in a remote part of the country in the developing world, that project may in fact be done with the full cooperation of the local community. But when they're building a small utility scale project and they're throwing the power onto the grid, such as it may be in that country, that may not have any benefit for the local community. Is that a distinction that's meaningful, or have I missed the point, Meredith?
I wouldn't say you've missed the point. I do think there's some elements that we just want to focus in on a little bit. Mm-hmm. One is that particularly in the developing world, we we feel as though we should have sufficient safeguards in place. We have a number of international standards, including those developed by the IFC and the World Bank, that touch on Indigenous people and Indigenous people's rights. In many cases, those standards don't actually apply because we aren't necessarily talking about communities that have been defined as, and I'll put up my finger quotes, Indigenous. They're communities that have been using this land, per eternity, but have not necessarily received that legal designation. So that protection does not exist to them. It is also, Andrea touched on this a little bit, we're also finding that the policies and practices that are in place are not codified within the renewable energy sector. So the standards and at least the lip service to the standards that we're seeing coming from the other industries, from natural resource extraction, simply doesn't exist in this industry yet. So part of what we need to do is ensure that if there's best intentions, that they're also captured and institutionalized, that they're implemented in a meaningful way. And that's a very important thing for an investor, because once an investor is committed to one of these projects, it's very, very challenging for them to remove their capital. So we need to ensure that all of those expectations are explicit up front, and that we understand how we're having these, frankly, I'll say best practices isn't something we can look for yet. Best practices still need to be developed, but an awareness and attention to how that awareness and attention to is being incorporated into their investments.
Andrea, let me just follow up with you on that. If best practices don't exist yet, I presume that emphasis there is on practices. What would be ideal in your mind for people to be doing in terms of addressing the concerns we've discussed today?
I think there's a perfect opportunity not just to avoid the problem, but also to come out in front of a lot of problems and really set up some of the be a little bit more at the vanguard of this shared value and shared benefit that we're seeking in the impact investing space. One thing that we've been exploring, even in the context of this investor briefing, is the idea that the voices of those who are affected should be at the core of what it means to develop best practices. Again, the best practices are oftentimes simply designed in whatever area you're looking at by investors that are sitting in an office in New York City. They don't really bring in the real lived experience of the communities. And I think that there's a perfect opportunity to be mindful of the fact that these communities are the ones that are ultimately impacted by them. They also know the issues a lot better than I might sitting in my own office. And both as a matter of right and as a matter of really getting to the core of what these practices should be, our role as the investor community should be to empower them and work on the capacity building piece so that their voices can be meaningfully heard in the process of designing the best practices.
And we have an incentive to do that as investors as well. A community that feels powerless and as if they are losing what's most important to them is the most volatile situation that you can go into as an investor.
Yes, and that gets back to this concept that you really developed early in our discussion today of this is a risk that investors need to manage. And part of the way they manage that risk then is to be inclusive with respect to the local communities where they're developing the projects. Am I thinking about that in simple terms the right way?
Exactly correct.
Okay. Listen, I want to just tap into your psyche. I want to understand a little bit of what makes you tick, because the work at Transform Finance is really pretty unique and special. Andrea, a lot of people look up to you for the work that you're doing, but who inspires you? Who do you look up to as a role model?
Well, thank you for the kind comments about our work. So we really focus on this intersection between two worlds that normally don't talk to each other. The world of finance on the one hand, and the world of social change, social justice, and community activism on the other. And we try to build a bridge in between them. So what I would say that, generally speaking, we look to a lot of other bridge builders that have been sitting in this somewhat uncomfortable but necessary in-between spaces. I would say that I'm inspired not by individuals necessarily, but by this many silent practitioners that are out there that are really fighting a good fight, as it were, in the space of indigenous rights, which is part of the work that I come from before coming to Transform Finance, and a lot of other community activists that are facing this insurmountable world of capital that is so much bigger and so much more sophisticated than they are. So that's where we draw a lot of the inspiration for our work.
And what about you, Meredith? Who do you admire and look up to as a role model?
I'll give the same genre of answer as Andrea to say that it may not be an individual person. I think what drives my work is this idea that we don't have to have, there's an unnatural dichotomy between this idea of having meaningful investments, and those investments must cause harm. That's not necessarily true. When you look at it, what an investment is at its very core, it's just a commitment to the future. And we can determine what future it is that we're looking to build. In the case of this report, we have a very strong ability to say that there's an incentive to the investors, those who currently hold the capital and are looking for that capital to grow, to also be considerate of the communities that they are going to be investing in and to improve those communities. And that's absolutely a driving force.
Andrea, you are really a talented guy. I mean, you got a law degree from Yale, as I recall. You could be doing any number of things. Why have you chosen this?
Well, I could be doing a number of things, and thank you for the talented comment. And I could be also doing a lot of forms of activism that would not be taking advantage of some of the skills or some of the opportunities that I've been fortunate enough to be handed. My thinking in starting Transform Finance with Morgan Simon was really to try to capitalize on this ability to move between the two worlds. So have a very deep engagement with social justice as a field, a very deep activist streak, but also being able to enter into the conversations with the investors, to be at least, if not trusted by them, have a somewhat friendly audience, because maybe we have gone to the same schools, because we might speak in similar ways despite the accent. So I really thought that the best way where I could position myself for making a change that is not necessarily what I decided that I like to do, but is where I can be very helpful, and it happens that I like to do it, was to figure out how to move in between those two spaces and serve to lift up some of the voices that are otherwise normally excluded from conversations around finance.
Excellent. And Meredith, what about you? Why do you do this?
You know, when we have an economic argument, when we're able to make a strong economic argument, when we have the balance sheet and the income statement in agreement, then it's a sustained change. We're very unlikely when there's a profit being made, it's very unlikely that will be, and one that's being done in a just way, then the drivers to change that are limited. We're more likely to have that change continue. So to the extent that we're able to build an economic argument and we're able to have community support, it's almost lazy. We can walk away and go on to something else.
Excellent. Now, Andrea, what's your superpower?
You know, I don't think I have a superpower. I don't mean to sound like a broken record, but I really do rely a lot on the power of the communities from whom we derive the strength for our work. If there is anything that I think is a little bit of a unique power or a unique angle, as I was saying earlier, it's this ability to sit in between these two fields and both bring social justice to the world of finance, but also bring the concepts of finance to the world of practitioners, activists, and social justice leaders. So being in the middle as a translator, as a megaphone, I think is probably where my power sits.
And I think that's a great superpower. Now, Meredith, what's yours?
I'll just add to Andrea's superpowers first. I think he's incredibly good at big picture thinking, and he has more energy than most. So I'll just add that in for him. I'm going to hedge on that one a little bit because I want to make sure that we also acknowledge other people involved in the report that have superpowers of their own. So we wrote this report also in coordination with the Business and Human Rights Research Center, and a woman named Iniko Horvath led the process almost entirely. And so therefore, herded a number of cats. We also had an expert advisory group that was participant, and Sonin Capital played a very large role. And what I would say, if we were going to bring my superpower back into that, is that I really believe in learning from others. So our expert advisory group, numbered in the 20s, and the minds that we had involved in this project were extraordinary. We learned quite a bit from them and improved the report significantly.
That's great. Well, I thank you both for taking the time to be with us today to share your thoughts and insights. And you really got me thinking about the challenges of renewable energy, which seems to me to be such an imperative for our generation, and the need for greater inclusivity with the local communities around the world as we develop these projects. So I appreciate you doing that. Andrea, tell us how people can get the report or the investor briefing, and also connect with you.
Absolutely. The report is available on our website. It's transformfinance.org, transformfinance.org. It's under investor resources. We'd welcome people to download it and to send us their comments. I can always be reached by email. I'm fairly good at responding even sometimes. It's Andrea, Andrea, at transformfinance.org. And I would really welcome everybody's feedback, because this is very much a work in progress.
Great. And Meredith, how do people get in touch with you?
You know, I don't have quite the same public face, as I'm working as an independent, but so I'd say through Andrea at this point, if people are comfortable with that. And I would mirror what he said in terms of, we're seeking to have this report be as strong as possible, to be as meaningful as possible, and to have as large a tent as possible. We're not dealing with simple issues here. They're extraordinarily complex, and we need as many good minds at the table as possible.
Oh, fantastic. Well, again, I thank you both for taking the time to be with us this afternoon, and wish you every success in the great work that you're doing.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us, Devin, and thank you really for putting the attention on this, on the issue that, while we absolutely need very quickly a transition to renewable energy, we need to make sure that it's fair and that it benefits.
Yes. Well, again, thank you. Now let's do some good.